Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce the last speaker of the day, Peter Ludlow from Unicamp. His talk is titled Red Queen Semantics. We can't hear you, Peter. Your microphone is off. Peter, we can't hear you. Let's see what's going on. Okay.
Okay, so did you have the the slides up yet or no?
No.
Okay. Well, let's get that going then. All right.
Now we're seeing the slides, but not in full mode screen.
Yep.
Yep, just get it full screen and you're done.
Yep, be there in a second. Okay, are we good?
Yes.
Okay.
Beautiful.
You're probably wondering what is Red Queen semantics, and I'm going to get to that. In the meantime, don't panic. I'm not going to. Red Queen semantics is not a replacement for what we as semanticists are doing right now, and all the impossible things we're trying to do. It's more like additional impossible things we have to do after we finish the impossible things we're working on right now. And I want to start with Perry on indexicals, because he gave a very clean way of understanding the problem with certain cases. He had certain first-person cases, certain temporal cases, certain cases that I would call locational. And my favorite is the first-person case. And my favorite example of the first-person case is one that he drew from a story involving Ernst Mach, who one day, I think he was getting on a subway, and he saw this person and thought to himself, who is that shabby pedagogue? Not realizing that he was looking in a mirror. And the puzzle in all of this is that there seems to be a kind of secret ingredient X involved here. Whereas there's a thought that Mach could have expressed as I am a shabby pedagogue, and then there's another one which he would express with the thought, or a token of the thought, that he is a shabby pedagogue. And the puzzle is that, knowing the former, the thought that gives rise to an utterance of the former case, number one, leads to different actions than the thought that would give rise to an utterance of number two. So, for example, if you're thinking, I am a shabby pedagogue, that can lead to getting a haircut, or getting a new suit, or getting a makeover. Now, the temporal case is pretty famous as well. That's the case where, let's say I have an appointment with the dean at 8 o'clock. I don't know it's 8 o'clock. I'm working in my office. I think to myself, I have an appointment with the dean at 8 o'clock. I don't do anything. I just sit there. I keep working in my little suit with my 1970s telephone sitting there. Okay. However, I might also realize that it's now 8 o'clock. I say to myself, or I have a thought which I express as, I have an appointment now, and I get up and I go to my appointment with the dean. And again, the issue is this: when I utter now, the proposition I express locates the appointment from an egocentric point of view, right? It's a position relative to me. And when I utter at 8 o'clock, the proposition I express locates the appointment from an eternal third person point of view. one way we could think of that is the view from nowhere, or the scientific perspectival position, as you will. Now, before I go any further, I want to do a little bit of clarification here regarding temporalism and tensors and so forth. So let's be clear that there are two different notions of tense at work here. One is grammatical tense, or if you prefer, verbal tense. The other is metaphysical tense, which is the idea that tense is a property of fundamental reality. And then there are two different philosophical positions at work here. One of them is the position of the tensors, who are going to argue that tense is ineliminable and irreducible. And then the position of the detensors, who fundamentally are going to say that metaphysical tense doesn't exist and tense is eliminable. Now, keep in mind, this is nothing about tense in the sense of where things are located on a timeline or something like that. This is a notion of priorian, like an prior sense of tense, where you are egocentrically located somewhere. Okay, so the detensor's position then is something like this. And so the canonical example of this would be Reichenbach's theory of tense. Let's say E2 is the time of utterance, then anything later than that is going to be in the future. Anything earlier than that is going to be the past. So it's something like this. And you're just defining past and future in times of relative positions on this eternal timeline. Another way of looking at it is that anyone who is predicating past and future with respect to a certain position is just doing it with respect to positions on this timeline. Whereas from the position of the tensor, you are embedded in that timeline. So when you say something is past, it doesn't mean just like earlier than a time of utterance. It is that you are embedded in that timeline and it's in your egocentric past, right? Now, what's the problem, or what's the big problem with this view from nowhere, which is the view you get with certain accounts of tense, and you get it with other accounts of indexicals as well? Well, the theory is that you've lost the egocentric information that's required to make sense of human action and emotion. Now, I just gave you a couple examples where it affects human action, right? Do you get up and go to the meeting? The human emotion case would be, for example, the case from Pryor on Thank Goodness That's Over, where you have, it's like the day after the root canal, and you say, well, thank goodness that's over with. And Pryor's point is that it's not enough to say that the root canal is earlier than a time of a particular utterance. You want to position that in your past, in your egocentric past. That's why you're relieved. Now, the godfather in all of this is Hector Neri Castañeda, who was all over this topic and really was the pioneer of investigating these kinds of constructions from a philosophical point of view. And I love this quote from Castañeda. When I act intentionally on an object, I care neither about the Russellian Kaplanian propositions beyond as such, nor about their Phrygian Kaplanian first reference. What he's saying here is, like, I'm not interested in the referential contents of these propositions when I act intentionally. Okay. These are not crucial. What I need is to bring those doxastic reference somehow into my experience through my thinking indexical, that is experiential references. The singular proposition that mobilizes my powers of deliberation and action is the indexical truth within my grasp. So what is he saying? He's saying that the referential content is not sufficient to explain his actions, for example. Now, there's a lot of philosophical literature that follows in this wake, and I want to give you a brief survey of some of it. So, for example, Colin McGinn has endorsed this view as well. So he says indexical concepts are ineliminable, crucial now, the ineliminable part, right? I mean, the ineliminability thing is going to be critical here, which is the idea that whatever you're doing when you're trying to give an account of an action or whatever, you're not going to be able to do it by removing indexicality from the meta language, as it were. Right? So indexical concepts are ineliminable because without them, agency would be impossible. When I imagine myself divested of indexical thoughts, employing only centerless mental representations, i.e. ipso, imagine myself deprived of the power to act, right? Regarding the issue of ineliminability, Francois Recanati is also on board here. As he puts it, no transformation from indexical to non-indexical is possible without affecting the cognitive significance of the utterance and therefore changing the thought it expresses. In other words, if you attempt to give a semantics for an indexical construction, and you do that in a way that eliminates indexical content or perspectival content, if you will, then you are going to lose the ability of your semantics to characterize the cognitive significance of the phenomena that you're talking about. Now, there's more here. And the point I want to make is that indexical content or perspectival content or egocentric content or whatever you want to call it, it's not merely ineliminable, but I'm going to make the case that it's actually ubiquitous. That is, the phenomenon is everywhere. And we think of it as like in these isolated cases that John Perry brought to us. But the case I'm going to make now is that it's just absolutely everywhere. And come back to McGinn, who argues that it's actually part of conscious thought, right? So McGinn says, there is also the kind of thought we operate with when actively engaged in the world, when the world is directly presented to our consciousness. And this seems shot through with indexicality. It thus seems that what the phenomenologist would call being in the world presupposes indexical thought. Now, what is he saying there? I think a good way to get a handle on what he's saying is to follow some work that's done by Susanna Siegel here. And I gotta say, I I think that's her kid Zoe there. I think, that's a Steve Pike photo. And I don't know how he does this, but he always just he's like a magician somehow, and that he catches these moments. Anyway, Susanna Siegel, sort of explicating why perception is indexical as well. So she says, many contentful experiences seem to have contents that must be specified by the use of indexical expressions, such as over there, to the left, here, in front of, behind me, just a second ago, a few seconds ago, and so on. And then she continues with the clear perceptual cases. For instance, some auditory experiences seem to present sounds as coming from a direction relative to the ears. Some proprioceptive experiences seem to present pressure sensations as located in specific parts of the body, locatable parts. Visual experiences seem to present things in locations relative to the eyes and the rest of the body. More generally, contentful experiences present the world from the subject's perspective, both in space and time. If one tried to characterize the perspective aspect of contents in language, it'd be natural to use indexical expressions for spatial properties, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So it's not just the funny John Perry cases, right? Even when you get into issues of like perception, there's an indexical quality or perspectival quality to that as well, right? So there's more. David Velleman has pointed out that, actually, if you think about the very act of moral reasoning, that's indexical too. And this is how he puts it. Kant's framing his maxim in the first person is no accident. He could not have restated it, for example, as Immanuel Kant will make lying promises when he is in need. Insofar as the target of universalization is a practical thought, it is essentially first personal, right? So it's like, I am lying. So you have the idea that the moral law is a moral law for me, right? And what Velleman is saying is that you can't eliminate that from your account of morality. You couldn't construct a Kantian theory of morality without first-person content. I argued in my book on the philosophy of generative linguistics that this is actually true for certain accounts of personal rule guidance. So if you thought that you, in some sense, unconsciously followed grammatical rules, the idea is that saying I have such a rule invites the interpretation that it's a rule for me, that I'm normatively guided by it. And in this case, it would be, say, a rule like subjacency. You're not even conscious of it, but it's still got to be a rule for me. And then I went all out a couple years ago in my book, Interperspectival Content. And I made the point, well, a couple points. One point is that, we think about scientific theory and we think that the polished, finished scientific theory doesn't have any perspectival content to it, that it's got to be the view from nowhere. But then think about scientific practice, right? So think about the context of experimentation. And what I did is I went and I looked up lab notes by various biologists and chemists and so forth. And when you read their lab notes and their the sort of what they say about their experimental setting is sort of completely larded with indexical content. And that makes sense, right? You're going to put that there, say you're working with a lab assistant, and you're saying things like put that there, etc. So if you just forget about sort of finished scientific product, which is supposed to give you the view from nowhere, if you actually thought about scientific context, experimentation, or for that matter, the application of a scientific theory to something, right? That's going to be larded with indexical content as well. And the other thing I pointed out in my book was that it's not just human actions and emotions and morality and so forth. We'll even see it in our theorizing about computation and informational states. So I argued that even informational states, even the theory of information, rests on a notion of perspectival content. So, for example, in that possibly fictitious story in American history of the ride of Paul Revere, when he's looking at the lights in the Old North Church, he's got to know, among other things, that that is information for him, that those are instructions for him. And that has to be part of the informational flow as well. If he doesn't know he's Paul Revere, it may not matter as long as he understands that that's a message for him. And so this goes on and on. I mean, the more you think about it, you find it everywhere. And this is part of why I was so excited with Julie's talk yesterday when she talked about rationalizing statements and how those too involve perspectival content or indexical content somehow. And I think what we're going to find is that it's it's just like all over the place. So now, what does that mean for semantics? Well, here's the thing, if you're a semanticist, you don't really have the luxury of ignoring perspectival content. If our job was just to give the semantics of finished scientific theories, you wouldn't have to worry about any of this. But the problem is that, when you're a semanticist, you have to give a scientific theory as it well of all of human language. And so you don't have the luxury of ignoring perspectival content because it's everywhere. And semantics, therefore, cannot embrace the view from nowhere. Now, this raises the question of what are we supposed to do about that? And there's an old solution, which is, you're going to have to introduce indexical senses into your semantics. And so you've got to have the secret ingredient. X has got to show up in the semantics in some form or other. So I'm a shabby pedagogue and he's a shabby pedagogue. They're going to have to display different senses or something like a sense. So there's going to be, there's two different ways you could look at this. Maybe there's a different sense of I versus he. I prefer to think that the sense is not really in that pronoun there, but rather in the predicate, so that the sense of am a shabby pedagogue is different than the sense of is a shabby pedagogue. That's good news if you happen to speak a pro-drop language. Okay, so now the details don't matter here. I mean, this is like so far this is completely general what I'm saying, right? So every semanticist in the audience should be happy, not happy, but there should be nothing triggering so far. So I can present this in a kind of T-theoretic way. So for example, I'm a shabby pedagogue is true if and only if I am a shabby pedagogue versus he's a shabby pedagogue is true if and only if Ernst Mach is a shabby pedagogue. So the left case expresses a first person or indexical or perspectival or egocentric sense content. Now, you can formalize this however you want, right? So if you have model theoretic tools in order to do the same work, that's fine. I don't care. But the issue is you're going to have something that's super fine grained that's going to be able to express or formalize the indexical sense content. But there are problems, of course. Otherwise, we would be doing this all over the place. The first problem is with example 1. I could give a theorem, a T theorem, something like my utterance now of I am hungry today is true if and only if I'm hungry today. Great, but what happens to that theorem tomorrow? Right? So there's a reason that in Davidson's original paper on semantics and T theories that he didn't disquote indexicals. So yeah, the whole paper is like cheerleading for disquoting, having a disquotational semantics in which you sort of lift the content of the object language into the meta language, but you didn't do that with indexicals, right? So instead you get something like the utterance U by S at time T of I am hungry today is true if and only if S is hungry at T or the day of T, however you want to put it. All right, so that's the first problem. Second problem, which I take to come from Perry, is that, well, look, yesterday and today, they're supposed to express different senses, surely, right? So it clearly means something different to say, the meeting's today versus the meeting was yesterday. And meanings of sentences are composed from the meanings of words. So then how does today is a fine day uttered today express the same thought as yesterday was a fine day uttered tomorrow? I mean, how can it possibly do that if they're composed from their parts and if, today and yesterday have different senses? How are you going to compose them and get something that has the same sense and therefore express the same thought? So there's a reason. I mean, there's like good reasons why people don't push the straight Phrygian line in semantics. Well, I mean, there are different solutions here. The referentialist solution is say, well, look, dude, I'm sorry. It's not the business of semantics to worry about these sense contents. So forget about semantics playing a role in accounts of human action and emotion and rational deliberation and rationalizing statements, et cetera, et cetera. That was never the business of semantics. That was not in our portfolio. So you get this, for example, in like Howie Wedstein's book, has semantics rested on a mistake? Or even semanticists like Kaplan and so forth, they're going to say, well, we don't really want this business in the semantics itself. Let's sort of push it out of there. Richard Kimberly Heck has a different kind of solution, which is that we give up the idea that we have the same thoughts across perspectival positions. So here's what he says. Why do we want to find something to call the meaning? What we relatively uncontroversially have are speakers who associate thoughts with utterances and restrictions upon how the different thoughts they associate with a given utterance must be related if they're to communicate successfully. Now, I mean, what does he mean by that? What he's saying is that, did I just lose my full screen?
No, it's fine.
Okay. what does he mean by that? What he means is that, look, there's a thought that you might express with today is a fine day, and another one that you would express tomorrow with yesterday was a fine day, but they're not the same thought, right? Or when I say I'm hungry, and then you look at me, you say you're hungry, you're not expressing the same thought. We're communicating, but those aren't the same thoughts. All right. My people, give me a second here. I'm having trouble shifting screens now. I don't know how to do. Okay. Okay. There is a missing doctrine here that I think has not really been noticed, right? There is a bad premise at work in this, which is that a sense is intimately tied to its manner of expression. So the senses expressed by today and yesterday remain constant across uses of those terms. And then the idea is, well, you got to reject that, right? So sometimes today and yesterday actually do express the same sense content. And the headline idea is that the same content can be expressed in different ways from different perspectival positions. Now, you might think, well, as I do, isn't this what Frege was saying all along? Because as you'll notice in the red highlighted portion there, right, although the thought is the same, its verbal expression must be different, right? And there's a very clean, well, first of all, let's get really clear on what we think this means. What I think it means is if you want to express the same content from different perspectival positions, you must change the way you express that content. If perspectival positions change, modes of expression must change. Now, here's a really clean version of that idea from Branquinho, who's in Lisbon. Uh, Cases where one is dealing with indexical contents are problematic because they often involve some realignment in the linguistic means of expression of a thought on the part of a given thinker as time goes by. Right? In other words, there are situations in which the verbal expression of indexical thought entertained by a thinker at a given time must, at a later time, be readjusted in a certain way by the thinker in order for the thought in question to be entertained. Right? So it's not like senses, it's about the actual expression must be changed in order to successfully express the content. Now, you might think, well, I think that like this is what Evans was getting at here, right? When he says Frege's idea is that being in the same epistemic state may require different things of us at different times. The changing circumstances force us to change in order to keep hold of a constant reference and a constant thought. We must run to keep still. And now you know what the Red Queen semantics is, because I'm pretty sure that when he says we must run to keep still, he is referencing Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and the idea of the Red Queen who has to keep running in order to stay in place. Or as the Queen puts it, now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. Now, I want you to see where this is going, which is that there's not going to be some content of an indexical utterance that you could sort of latch onto and hang on to it, and that's going to be good in all contexts, right? From the view from nowhere. That if you really want a handle on what that content is, you're going to have to stay in motion and keep expressing that in different ways at different times and places. And I understand that sounds like a lot of work. So in semantics, we have something like my utterance now, if I'm hungry today, is true if and only if I'm hungry today. So I can choose to recall that underlying thought, and I can always tell you what I was thinking. For example, the following day, I could say to you, well, I was hungry yesterday. And assuming that you can understand what I said, then there's a semantics for what I said deployed by you, which looks like this. You're utterance now of I was hungry yesterday is true if and only if you were hungry yesterday, right? So it's not a disquotational semantics, it's more complicated. There's a kind of coordination game that has to go on here. And Evans, this is continuing on his run to keep still passage. The acceptance on day 2 of yesterday was fine, given the acceptance on day D1 of today is fine, can manifest the persistence of a belief in just the way in which acceptance of different utterances of the sentence, the sun sets in the west can. So what then is Red Queen semantics? It's the ability, or sorry, it's the theory of our ability to continually update our local semantic theories based on changes in our perspectival positions. What grounds that ability? Well, it's going to be a theory of cognitive dynamics. So the key point here then is there is no object O that underlies or unifies our episodes of thought, right? When we keep invoking previous thoughts, or when we sharing thoughts or something, there is no interperspectival content, zero. There's no Russellian proposition, no data structure, etc., that unifies everything. The unified thought is itself a kind of abstraction here. Now, there's a whole book complaining about this approach by Herman Capellan and Josh Dever. And here's a complaint that they raise. Actually, they raise it in a footnote, but it's very well articulated. One problematic feature of the view, this is my view, is that it implies that the true semantics of language can only be stated in the right context. In particular, the full semantics of the language can't be said at one time or in one place or for one person. Prima facie, it's bizarre to be told the following. Let me tell you how our best scientific theory of how English works. I'll have to go stand on the other side of the room to tell you part of it. What are they saying? Well, what they want is the view from nowhere. I mean, that's basically what they're saying. Why isn't your semantics of English going to be allow us to have the view from nowhere? And you say, was that really what they're after? Well, yeah. If you look at the sort of highlighted expressions in their quote, when they talk about the true semantics of language or the full semantics, or can't be said at one time in one place, what they want is just one statement of the thing. That's what a scientific theory is supposed to do, right? View from nowhere, you state it once, it's good everywhere. Take it anywhere. Take it anywhere in the universe, it's good. However, they kind of give us a way out here at the end of that quote. There are, of course, moves you could make. Maybe a theory of cognitive dynamic works for yesterday and today. It's hard to see how to extend it to here, but we won't explore those moves here. Well, I'm going to explore those moves. So look, what you need then is a theory of cognitive dynamics, which is to say, how is it that expressing the egocentric content can be coordinated across different locations if there's no single thing that you can latch onto. So there's certain easy parts, which sometimes get called the natural realignment cases. And then there's a hard part where the most famous case would be the Rip Van Winkle case, where you don't get a natural realignment case. So the natural realignment case we mentioned today and yesterday. So you could have a simple rule, anything I express today with today, tomorrow I'm going to be able to express with yesterday, and the next day with the day before yesterday, etc. And you might even say, well, I can do something like that with now, which is that the idea here is that, actually every time you use the expression now, it's not really the same word. You are kind of rebuilding that so that you have separate utterances of now, and each time it's invoking a new egocentric position. I mean, all right, you could say that could be automatic, but then there are these weird cases that are brought to our attention by David Kaplan, and as we could call this the non-natural realignment case. If one says today is beautiful on Tuesday and yesterday was beautiful on Wednesday, one expresses the same thought according to the passage quoted. Yet one can clearly lose track of the days and not realize one is expressing the same thought. Seems then that thoughts are not appropriate bearers of cognitive significance. What he means is You're going to have to anchor it with a Russellian proposition or something. What he's talking about here is the Rip Van Winkle case, where Rip goes to he's sitting there thinking today is a fine day, and then he falls asleep for 10 years, and he wakes up and says yesterday was fine, right? Does he really have access to that earlier thought if he can no longer realign? And Evans just gave up on this one. He said, well, look, I see no more strangeness in the idea that a man who loses track of time cannot retain beliefs than in the idea that a man who loses track of an object cannot retain the beliefs about it with which he began. And if you're saying, well, what do you mean? Like that, your intuition is correct. So Evans had this view, like if say I'm holding a ball bearing and I'm having a thought about it, and then like I drop that ball bearing into a giant bin of ball bearings, I can no longer locate it. Then what he's saying is like I've lost that thought. That sounds crazy to me. And I think that Rip Van Winkle still has access to the thought that he had when he woke up and said that today is when he woke up and wanted to uh, uh, maintain the thought that he had the previous day. So in my book on interperspectival content, I said, look, Evans just gave up too easily here. Just because he didn't give a true perspectival account, it doesn't mean that Rip can't give a true perspectival account. He just failed to express his thought correctly. So he could have said something like that day when I fell asleep, or when I last fell asleep, that day was fine. So the idea is you don't lose the capacity to express your earlier thought. You don't lose that earlier thought. It's just that you have to be careful about how you go about expressing it. But all of this sort of leaves in the background. Wait, how do we get to the right expressions here? And the base sort of one core idea here is that word meanings are dynamic, or part of the solution here is going to be this idea that I tried to develop in my book, Living Words, where there the idea was that look, always forget about a static fragment for English or whatever. We're building little micro languages on the fly. And the word meanings are dynamic in that, so each little micro language that we build as we move through time, we are renegotiating the meanings of the words that we deploy in that micro language. Sorry. Before that, this picture just cracks me up. Anyway, that's my co-author Richard Larson, looking very tough at a Stony Brook graduation, holding what looks like a club. Anyway, in our 1993 paper on interpreted logical forms, we talked about this idea with respect to giving accounts of sense. And our idea was that interpreted logical forms are also constructed on the fly, specifically to express senses. And in particular, there were components of that. So the idea is that, all right, so just so you know where we are, we're not going to have something like a Kaplanian proposition to anchor all these, our ability to say that the same thought is had in different perspectival positions, right? What we want is a theory that sort of ties together or unifies all this without there being some object O that does the unifying. So the thought was that in ascribing a belief, where you have a speaker S and a hearer H, and there's some agent that they want to ascribe a belief to, there's going to be a kind of modeling task that goes on where you're thinking about, well, what are the goals of belief ascription? And what we called a theory of belief ascription logistics, where in this case, logistics is shipping the right expressions into what we want to say. So in selecting an interpreted logical form, S and H have to agree on the expressions used to speak of the components of the model of A's belief structure. So we're building models, and part of that is to negotiate the expressions we're going to use to do that. So sometimes psychologists like Herb Clark would call this entrainment. And then you draw on a lot of stuff, right? The speaker and the hearer draw on a lot of stuff to construct the model and expression. You know, what are the H's interests? You know, why am I giving this report to you? General principles of common sense psychology that I expect you to share, knowledge which we have about the agent A, etc. And then, okay, so now we're in the phase where we have a kind of work in progress. If you're going to really build a Red Queen semantics, what's going on? What do you need? How would that unfold? Well, you're going to need that part that I just talked about, the idea that you're going to have this way of modeling, not just A's psychology, but the expressions we're going to ship in order to articulate that. But you're also going to need to build into that model the perspectival position that needs to be incorporated into the models, right? So the perspectival position of each individual, S, H, and A, needs to be incorporated in those models. So expressions used in those models may sometimes flow from natural realignment, yesterday, today, or in other cases, they're going to have to be negotiated, like we did in the ILF case. All right. Now, where are we? So one helpful way to think about microlanguages is that they're constructed to aid in an account of someone's psychological states or what they said, the content of what they're thinking or what they said, and that microlanguages thereby express theories constructed on the fly. But notice that these are special kinds of theories. It's not like the theory of gravity. It's not like general theories that you could present with the view from nowhere, right? These are local theories. They only work in specific locations and at specific times. And then, okay, that's fine. You have the Red Queen semantics thing, and somehow you're going to have to construct a theory of how we play this coordination game, if you will. But this does leave behind a need for a kind of general theory. What is that general theory? Well, how are these local theories constructed on the fly by human agents, right? So, okay, so human agents build these little theories on the fly, passing theories or whatever you want to call them. And so then that's the problem of Red Queen semantics, okay? What is the general property that humans have that gives them ability to construct these theories? Is it a tractable problem? It's certainly a very hard problem, I'll give you that. And that's it. I'm going to end on that somewhat depressing. It's not a depressing note, but it's like it's a lot of work left to do. So thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Peter. So we'll move now to the Q&A. Daniel.
Hi, thanks, Peter. So I was interested in I guess a couple of things. When you're talking about the ILFs, and I guess the picture there has to do with like attitude descriptions and stuff like that. But I'm wondering if the picture that you're suggesting for like this Red Queen semantics is we don't need to. It's not just constructing these theories on the fly for attitude descriptions, but even just for like utterance interpretation in general. And then I think the reason why I'm asking this is that it's like completely ubiquitous is because so let's say we have communication where I say something like, oh, I'm hungry, and that seems like it's expressing where I have like a day say thought that I'm hungry. It seems a good candidate for a day say thought, like it's immune to error misidentification or whatnot, whatever. And then yet, if I communicate it, there's this picture of communication where like, I transmit the content of my thought, from my head into your head. And, this is kind of in some of the models of communication, but of course, every once in a while people say like, well, that can't be the right, picture. Because, if I'm communicating some day say content to you, like you're just misunderstanding it. If like you update, your model of what's going on with this day say content, right?
You mean if you say I'm hungry and I represent it as I'm hungry?
Yeah, I mean, so like that's not, that if we're communicating, so clearly it's not, and I say that, it's clearly something else is going on than like this transmission of content, right? Like from my head, to yours. There has to be something else going on, which is like, something more, interpretive or with something having to do with the interpreting the cognitive dynamics of speakers. I mean, that's an easy case, but I guess you can make it more difficult.
Well, to me, that's part of communication, right?
Yeah.
That the cognitive dynamics are part of it. So for the communication to be successful, the cognitive dynamics have to be successful.
So you would reject like this, for example, like I don't know, to be more specific about it, you would reject like a picture of like the common ground model of communication, or at least like a simple version of it, let's say, where, if I say P, you update the common ground with, you update the common ground by intersecting P or something.
Yeah, I would have to update that story. There would have to be there's no simple way to characterize the common ground. That is that we would all have different ways of representing the quote unquote common ground. Well, what makes it common ground? Well, you have to have a theory of why it's common ground, even though I'm representing it one way and you're representing it another way, right? So there's no data structure that's shared between us. We have, as it were, different data structures that get us to the same common ground.
Cool. Got it. Thanks.
Julie.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is delightful. I have your book on my reading list. I should probably promote it to read earlier. My question is, why is it Red Queen semantics rather than Red Queen pragmatics? And the reason I'm asking is that Robert Stalnaker has a whole story about self-located knowledge in semantics, and sorry, in pragmatics. And in his book, Our Knowledge of the Internal World, which is, of course, the allusion to Russell's Our Knowledge of the External World, he starts with the idea that we do not represent any kind of information, not from a perspective. So we start in the middle, not from the objective position, not from the internal position, not from the external position. And then he developed self-locating knowledge and all the stuff that you're talking about. It's being ubiquitous. It's involving the words, meanings, etc. So why can't we have our normal, quote unquote, semantics put it into the Red Queen pragmatic Stalnakerian style and call it a day?
I think that's a great question, and I've thought about that a lot. And my general response is something like this. Well, okay, there's a kind of bookkeeping thing, like whose job is this sort of thing, and what part of it's like bookkeeping within cognitive science. Is this like the job of semantics, or is this the job of pragmatics? And most philosophers, Kaplan and so forth, are going to be it's going to be the job of something that looks more like pragmatics. So I have two things to say here. One is that it seems to me that it can be the job of semantics, or what I recognize as being semantics, and that the sort of typical pragmatic tools, I can let me put it this way: I can give like a kind of clean story in which there is a lot of movement in terms of the lexicon, and the lexicon is going to be dynamic, et cetera, et cetera. And then the pragmatic part of this is going to be very simple. It's going to be a kind of pretty much vanilla Gracian pragmatics, right? And at least in a particular setting, the semantics is going to be pretty simple too, right? I mean, once everything's nailed down to a particular space-time location from a certain perspectival position, the semantics looks like it usually does. The pragmatics looks like a Gracian pragmatics, and then the moving parts is the dynamic lexicon part. So it's hard for me to come up with an argument that says, well, you've got to do it that way. But as a philosopher, I like doing it that way because the semantics for a philosopher is where the rubber meets the road. And so that's where I can extrude metaphysical consequences from what I'm saying and so forth. So that's a long answer. Have you spaced out in my answer to your question? The short version of the answer is something like, I think that the semantics and the pragmatics can be kept simple if we do our bookkeeping and cognitive science in this way.
Okay, so your view is that way we will have a straighter line to metaphysics. That's the strongest appeal, if not an argument, then an appeal for choosing.
I also do think it's a kind of a straight line from semantics to metaphysics here, because I believe in metaphysical tense, for example. And I think when we talk about tense and semantics and deployed in the semantics, that has metaphysical consequences.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Bridget, go ahead. Thanks
so much for this talk. It really scratched an itch for me about metaphysical tense. Just to say that, because I honestly I couldn't understand really why anybody would be a detensor, but I get what the stakes are now, and it's good to see what you're doing with it and how to counter those objections. I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a connection. Thinking about why the view from nowhere might be attractive or might have become attractive to philosophers, I wanted to ask if you know this book. This is a book on objectivity by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. And it's a history of actually of pictures in scientific atlases. And they start in, I guess, the 17th century, where they find, like Linnaeus as the prototypical scientist, and it's all about Linnaeus, right? It's all about what he knows. And then somewhere around the 19th century, people start to say, no, I am a scientist, therefore I have this epistemic, morals that I have to step back. I have to take myself out of it. Anyway, that's a book I'm reading that I think is wonderful. It's Objectivity by
Yeah, very cool. I'm definitely going to take a look at that, because you listen to this and you think, well, okay, but if it doesn't really work for semantics, like is it really is it working in other places as well? I mean, there's always been a kind of, philosophers of science and physics have noticed there's a kind of always been an uneasy tension among natural scientists historically, going back to Galileo, between the experimental setting, which is completely perspectival, and then the theoretical level, and then you get into certain quantum physics cases where you're affecting events by virtue of the observation itself. So if you start thinking in those terms, well, then, if the very act of observation is having an effect here, then what happened to that firewall between the sort of observational perspectival position and the view from nowhere? It looks like that distinction is collapsing at that point.
Anyway, thanks for the talk.
Sure enough.
Martina.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great talk. And I guess I realized I'm doing Red Queen syntax because
All right. Yeah. Okay. All right.
in my structure, which arguably is more like a generative semantics type of structure, where I encode quite a bit of meaning in the structure, and my reasoning for that was like my logic was because like the spine, I call the spine, regulates the interpretation of particular lexical entries. So if you have one lexical entry meaning one thing in one position and another one in another position, and I'm arguing that the spine contributes to meaning, and even indexicality for me is a matter of the spine, because if you think about what the first person pronoun means in a compound, it's no longer indexical. So if you have the me generation, it just means the self-centric, it's not an indexical me. It means something about self.
But does the spine itself change based on the context?
The spine has I didn't have time to talk about it, but I have these abstract arguments, which are in a sense contextual variables. So like for tense, it would be introducing the utterance time, for example. And for my grounding layers, it is the speaker ground, which will be, perspectival. And also I have these two grounds, like you said, that there's no representation for the common ground. The common ground is built on the fly.
Let me, sorry to interrupt, but let me ask the question another way. So, like with Cinque, you've got the spine and like, everything's always there, right? So like,
but it's not cartography.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
All right.
It's not cartography, it's much more abstract. So I think thematical categories are constructed. But like, I just wanted to make that connection. And one of the things that really puzzles me actually is why languages would even bother to come up with pronouns. Like, why do languages have first and second pronouns? If in our representation of the meaning, we have to adjust it to, like, if I say I'm hungry, you have to represent it as Martina is hungry, and not as I am hungry or speaker is hungry, because that changes. So it's actually, to me, a mystery that languages have pronouns.
I feel that. I feel like all the heavy lifting is done with the predicates, as it were.
Right. And then the other thing, like again, the kids are really important, because if I'm right, and if the communicative aspect of language is part of the structure, kids start very early with some of these elements that are high up there. So the classic view that the tree grows upwards can't be right on that view, but instead I'm developing this view that the tree grows inwards. So kids start at the top and at the bottom, and then grow it in. And I think it all starts with pointing. Pointing is the first time that you get some kind of predicate, and that connects classifying the world and relating it to an interlocutor. And so, yeah, so I think, yeah, I feel like there's a connection between what we do, and yeah, that's, I'm also,
I hear that. That makes total sense to me. Sure.
yeah. So that's all I had to say. Thank you, and I really loved your talk. Thank you.
Great. Nilanjan?
Yeah, I hope my microphone is working. So I was thinking about Davidson's paper, Nice Derangement of Epitaphs. So when you were speaking, and Davidson says, I think he almost says the same thing, that you are interpreting the other person on the fly.
Yeah.
So he sort of seems to conclude from this that there is no such thing as mastery of language, and there is no language or something like that. So I just wanted to ask, according to you, what is the knowledge of language then? So what do I learn when I learn a language?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because I wasn't really sure on time allocation, and I was about to mention Davidson and his paper, Nice Derangement of Epitaphs, in which he talks about this. And for those that don't know, the idea is that you build these passing theories, which is very much like what I have in mind with the idea of microlanguages. And I actually asked Davidson about this too, because he has, on the one hand, he's got the whole business with T theories, and then he's got this business about passing theories. And I asked him, well, is this like a unified theory? And he said, yeah, because it's sort of like you're building new T theories every time, which is exactly what I'm proposing here. So then, well, so then what's the theory? How do we do it? Well, one way of if I'm going to put it in the Davidson way, instead of just building one fragment, one T theory for one fragment, that's the thing, what you have is this ability to keep building new T theories, right? Every time you engage with somebody new, every time you construct a new passing theory, you're building new T theory, right? So that's kind of the idea. And then the project is, well, what underlies that ability? What are the ingredients or components to that ability?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for your talk once again, and thank you everyone for staying until the end of the session, especially those of you who are located in the other side of the Atlantic. We will continue tomorrow, so see you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.